Hi, my name is David Higgins, and in this Introduction to Writing Skills presentation, I'm going to be talking about clauses, commas, and semicolons. So we're digging into grammar here. Essentially, clauses are parts of speech, and commas and semicolons are commonly misused punctuation. All of these things are actually very easy to learn, or can be easy to learn, if you take the time to break the rules down into smaller, simpler parts, sort of learn them one at a time, and put them into use. The problem with a lot of things when it comes to commas and semicolons is that sometimes what we think of as common sense in terms of how we would use a comma, the idea that you use a comma whenever you'd pause, for example, is kind of true, but also kind of not true. It can work for informal writing, but for formal writing, particularly for the kind of formal writing that you'll be doing for college classes, you're going to want to really have a good sense of what clauses are and how commas and semicolons are used effectively to link together parts of sentences. Again, I don't think this is actually very hard once you spend a little time to break it down into parts and think about how it works. So what I'm going to do is I'll walk through, starting with talking about clauses, and then go into discussing the use of commas and semicolons. I'm going to start with clauses because I think if you can make just a very basic distinction between independent clauses and dependent clauses, it becomes very, very easy to know how to use commas and semicolons. So this is sort of the prerequisite knowledge that you have to have in order to do some of the trickier stuff here. Don't be too intimidated by any of that, though. Let's just start from the beginning. We'll work our way through. If you've got any questions at the end, we'll be able to find a way to work that out. So let's start here. Independent clauses. Sometimes you hear a phrase like this, independent clause, and you can become intimidated. Oh, that's grammar speech. English teachers talk about independent clauses. Somebody taught me that when I was in 6th grade or something, and I forgot what it was. Don't be intimidated by this language. Clause just means a part of speech, a chunk of words that are together in a sentence or coming out of your mouth. It's a clause. They're all clauses. Clause is just a part of speech, all right? An independent clause is just a part of speech that stands alone. So anytime someone says independent clause, you could think a complete sentence that stands alone. All right? That's all you need to be thinking about whenever I or anyone else uses the phrase independent clause. An independent clause is just a part of speech that can stand alone. If you can begin it with a capital letter and end it with a period and it appropriately stands alone as a sentence, it's an independent clause, generally speaking. Okay? So let's break that down even a little bit more. All right? In order for something to be an independent clause or a part of speech that could stand alone without needing anything else, it has to have three things. One, it has to have a subject. And the subject often is also the actor, the subject or actor. Two, it has to have a verb or an action. These are the basic components of any sentence. In order for there to be a sentence, there has to be an actor and an action, a subject and a verb. If you were to say, I, that's not a sentence because it's simply a subject, right? An actor, right? That's not a complete sentence if I say I. If I say, grovel. That's not really a complete sentence unless I'm giving it as a command to someone, in which case there's an implied, actor. But don't worry about that, right? Grovel is not a complete sentence that stands alone. You could say, I grovel, or I run, or my dog barks, all right? In each of these tiny fragments of speech, you have a subject or an actor and a verb or an action. As long as you have those two things, you have a complete sentence or an independent clause that stands alone. So just remember that. Subject or actor, verb or action, and it has to stand alone. That's the other thing. Sometimes there's these other words that can come into play. Sometimes you'll have a subject, and you'll also have a verb, but there will be another word that makes it so that it doesn't stand alone. All right? I might say, I walk. That is an independent clause. Subject, verb, begins with a capital, ends with a period, stands alone, independent clause. Good deal. But if I were to add the word because at the beginning, suddenly subject verb does not stand alone. I wouldn't walk up to someone and say, because I walk, period. That would be absurd because the person that you were talking to would say, because you walk what? So think about that, right? Subject, verb, and it has to stand alone. There has to not be anything that causes it to be waiting for something else to happen or something along those lines, all right? That's independent clauses. See, and this is what's going to happen a lot of times here, I think, with grammar discussions. You might start off with a piece of fancy language that sounds very complicated or sounds very technical, but you realize it's actually kind of commonsensical. An independent clause is just a subject, a part of speech that's got a subject and a verb, and that can stand alone on its own. I walk, I run, you drive, something like that. All right, so some examples. I've already given you some examples, but here's a few very specific examples of independent clauses or parts of speech, sentences that stand alone. The dog runs fast. Okay? So in this case, everything on the screen that has that's isolated in red, those are subjects or actors. All right? Everything in green is actions or verbs. So you'll notice in all of these cases, you have a subject, you've got a verb, and the sentence stands alone. Notice that there's some other information sometimes too. The dog runs fast. It doesn't have to be the dog runs, period. The dog runs fast, period. Great, that stands alone. He loves to play fetch, period. Okay? Note that in this case, he is loving, he's not playing, right? That's extra information, right? He loves to play fetch. Jane works hard. She pays her bills on time. In each of these cases, you can see that there's a subject in red, there's a verb in green, period at the end of the sentence. Nothing is stopping it from standing alone and making sense in the way that it stands alone. Now, let's look at some things that are not independent clauses. All right? These would be problem cases, not independent clauses. Why? Well, because it runs fast. Well, all right, it runs fast would be an independent clause, but look, we've added an extra word that makes the sentence not stand alone, right? You wouldn't say, because it runs fast. Well, because it runs fast what? That depends on what came before or what's going to come after. In this case, loves to play fetch. What's missing? Well, you can see nothing in red. He loves, she loves, the dog loves. There's a missing subject in this case. That means not an independent clause. After Jane works hard, all right? In this case, we've got the subject, Jane, we've got the verb, works, but the word after makes it so that it's not independent. After Jane works hard, what? She likes to drink a beer. She likes to unwind and watch television. Something else needs to be there in order for that to be a complete idea. Therefore, it's not independent. Was paid on time. What's missing here? Again, the subject is what's missing here. John was paid on time. Juan was paid on time. Something like that. So remember, when you're assessing, first of all, to whether something is an independent clause or an independent part of speech or not, the core part of the speech, the anchor of the sentence. The anchor of every sentence is going to be an independent clause. In any sentence, there needs to be a part that if you stripped everything away, it would stand alone. And that's going to be an actor, a subject, and a verb and action, right? That's going to be the core of every sentence. So in this case, we can see why these are problem examples that are not independent clauses. All right? In each case, either the subject is missing or there's modifying words that cause the part of speech to be what we call a dependent clause. All right? I'll go back to this again. These here, because it runs fast, after Jane works hard, these are dependent clauses. What's a dependent? Well, if you've got a baby, for example, that's a dependent. It doesn't stand alone yet. Someday it will grow up and hopefully stand alone. But until it does, that baby, he or she, is going to need care, feeding, attention. It's attached to someone else that is providing its primary care. Sentences work just the same way. There's adult parts of sentences and there's baby parts of sentences. Or we might say there's independent parts of sentences and there's dependent parts of sentences. A dependent clause, like we saw with the ones preceding, are simply parts of speech that don't stand alone because it requires something else in order to be complete. That is a dependent clause. So if we were to go back here, the dog runs fast, independent clause, subject verb stands alone, right? Because it runs fast, dependent clause. We need The dog wagged its tail because it was running fast, right? You need some other information for that dependent or baby part of the sentence to link back up to. All right? So that's basically all we have to talk about in terms of clauses, right? We're simply talking about whether or not it's a part of speech that stands alone or whether it's a part of speech that needs something else in order to stand alone. From there, we can now move into talking about commas and semicolons. Note, by the way, that independent clauses and dependent clauses are all valid parts of speech. It's not that a dependent clause isn't grammatically incorrect as long as it's appropriately attached to something that's independent. And I'll talk about this more in another presentation that I'm going to do, but essentially think of it this way. An independent clause, an independent sentence that stands alone is always going to be fine. But a dependent clause needs to be linked to something else in order for it to make sense. Just like you wouldn't leave a baby alone in a crowded shopping mall, you wouldn't leave a dependent clause alone in a crowded paragraph. That was a terrible metaphor, but hopefully you get the idea. You want to be able to identify the part of, the main thing, why I'm talking about all that first is, you need to be able to identify independent and dependent clauses in order to really appropriately figure out some of the places where the biggest errors with commas and semicolons occur. All right? So that's what we'll move into next, commas and semicolons. Just as a quick review, comma is the small little hooked piece of punctuation that happens in a sentence like this that often indicates a pause of some sort. A semicolon is like a colon, the two dots, but it's a dot on top with a comma on bottom. That's commas and semicolons. I found this on the internet. I thought this was very nice. This is a whole meme that's going around when it comes to commas. Commas save lives. If you look this up, if you go on Google or something like that and you search for commas, you're going to see, and you do the images, you're going to see all these kinds of things. Let's eat grandma versus let's eat grandma. Commas save lives. In one case, hopefully I don't need to point this out too much, but in one case, let's eat grandma would imply let's eat grandma, right? Which hopefully you're not wanting to do. Let's eat, comma, grandma is a bit more sensible. And the difference between your grandma being alive or not being alive, as the internet will tell you, comes down to the comma. Now that's not a independent clause, dependent clause thing. That's just sort of a humorous example. Let me show you why the clause thing matters when you're thinking about your commas and your semicolons. Oh, actually, sorry. Before I get into that, this is another moment. Why are commas important? Why are commas important? Essentially, commas are probably the most overused sometimes and underused part of sentence construction and grammar. It's funny, I think we don't think about commas when they're being used well. Readers, if you're reading along and the commas are all where they're supposed to be, you don't think about it at all. But if your commas are not where they're supposed to be, it can sometimes make well, you know, in some cases it can totally change the meaning of what you're trying to say. You might think you're writing, let's eat grandma, and if you forget to put the comma, someone might completely misinterpret that and say, let's not eat grandma. And then you'll be like, whoa, no, hold on a second. I wasn't saying that. Well, the comma is, you know, when you're not there to verbally show what you mean, what you've got is punctuation, right? And so the punctuation is what communicates your meaning. Also, bad punctuation, punctuation that doesn't need to be there, can jump out and can be kind of embarrassing. As you know, I love looking for these internet memes. You wouldn't think that it would be really fun to go online and look up commas and semicolons and Google images, but boy, you will find some funny stuff because people have been memeing this stuff like cat videos, right? So anyway, right, here's an example someone posted. Calling someone fake, comma, won't make you real. Calling someone dumb, comma, won't make you smart. Calling someone ugly, comma, won't make you beautiful. Calling someone mean, comma, won't make you polite. To which the memer replies, using unnecessary commas will make you annoying. So in each of these cases, you don't need these commas here, right? Calling someone fake won't make you real. It all goes together. Calling someone dumb won't make you smart. Well, there's some irony here with this person's use of punctuation. So anyway, if you don't want to end up the victim of mockery on the internet, figure out how to use your commas and semicolons. And it's more than that too, right? I mean, I think the reason why we have this attention to punctuation is because it makes communication clearer, more precise, easier to follow, and it just smooths our communication process all the way around. By the way, as far as I'm concerned, this is all, I'm talking about this really for, I mean, people may judge you for your internet writing if you are using your punctuation incorrectly. As far as I'm concerned, I'm really concerned with my students using punctuation correctly in formal essays. You're going to do a lot of informal writing in college where this stuff won't make as much of a big deal. I certainly won't jump down anyone's throat if they send me an email that doesn't have perfect punctuation. But for formal writing where you're trying to communicate in a precise way with your audience to really get across ideas, sometimes complicated ideas, that's where you want to do this. Practice it in other places as well, but just make sure that you pay extra attention to this for your formal writing assignments. Okay, so here's what people forget. There are all kinds of comma rules that are easy to remember. We're going to talk about those in this presentation also, but I'm going to get to them later because they're the easy ones. Items in a list, right? I ate apples, comma, bananas, comma, and cookies, period, right? We know, I think generally speaking, that we separate items in a list with commas. There's some tricks to that, and I'll talk you through it, but overall, there's a lot of commas that are very commonsensical, right? That we can use our gut instinct around. However, there is a rule that people often forget or have trouble remembering or might not have ever learned in the first place, and that's this one. This is going to take a little bit of discussion, right? But again, I'm going to use a bunch of language here that's going to sound somewhat intimidating to some of you at first, but when you think about it more carefully and closely, once I break it down, you're going to see that this is really easy. If you can do 3 plus 3 equals 6. If you can do, basic kinds of logical stuff, this is going to be super simple for you. So don't get intimidated. Here's the rule that people forget. You use either one thing or another thing, all right? And they're equivalent. You can use them the same way. You use either a comma and a coordinating conjunction, and these are the words that are the coordinating conjunctions: for, and, nor, but, or, so, yet, okay? You use either a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon, all right, in order to link two independent clauses. Now here's where you've got to remember what we've learned about clauses, all right? Independent clause just means a sentence that would stand alone. So you've got one sentence that stands alone, another sentence that stands alone. Well, you can take them and put them together using either comma and, comma for, comma but, comma yet, right? Or you can use a semicolon. That's the whole rule. Now don't get scared, I'm going to break that all down for you. But just remember, right, as I'm moving forward, two independent clauses, two sentences that would stand alone, you link them together in one of two ways. One uses a comma and one of these special words, the other one uses a semicolon, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of how this works. So to start off with, we have two independent clauses. First, the dog runs fast. Why is that an independent clause? It's got a subject, the dog. It's got a verb, runs. It's not dependent. We don't say because the dog runs fast. We don't say until the dog runs fast. All right? It's a complete sentence that stands alone. The dog runs fast. Second sentence that stands alone. He loves to play fetch. Subject, he, the actor, he, loves, verb, so we've got the basics down, to play fetch. No extraneous information that gets us confused or whatever, okay? So now you're thinking, how do I link those together? Maybe that's kind of choppy. I don't want to have all these little sentences. The dog runs fast. He loves to play fetch. He chews on his bone. He goes to bed. Well, that's fine. That's all legal, right? You can do that, right? But often we want our sentences to flow together a bit more smoothly or to be a bit more interesting in terms of how they sound. That's when we start linking them together. And one of the ways that you link them together is using either a comma and a coordinating conjunction, which are those special words, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, or a semicolon. And it's as easy as this. Right? The dog runs fast, comma, and, right? So that's the linking thing right there, comma, and. The dog runs fast, comma, and. He loves to play fetch. Easiest thing in the world, right? So that's how it works. One sentence that would stand alone, another sentence that would stand alone, comma, coordinating conjunction. The dog runs fast, comma, and he loves to play fetch. The dog runs fast, comma, but not as fast as the other dog. Or he does not. The dog runs fast, comma, but he does not run as fast as the other dog. I'll explain why that's important in just a moment, okay? Now, the trick is, Anytime that you're using a comma and one of those special words, those coordinating conjunctions, right, you could instead just use a semicolon. Sometimes people call semicolons alternatives to periods, because you could just put a period there. The dog runs fast, period, he loves to play fetch. Well, take the period out, use the semicolon instead, obviously, change the capitalization. Works the same way, all right? Now, that's the basic rule. If you're with me so far, you've pretty much learned the most difficult thing that there is to learn in this entire grammar lesson, because everything after this is way more commonsensical. There's just a few little things that you've got to pay attention to. This sentence down here, for example, the dog runs fast and loves to play fetch. Note, I did not say comma and loves to play fetch. Why not? Well, look closely, right? Often when I teach this, people think, oh, I would use comma and, comma but, comma yet, comma nor, comma with those special words. But that's not always the case. You have to also remember you use comma and to link together what? Independent sentences that would stand alone. So think about this. The dog runs fast. Would that stand alone? Sure. Subject dog, verb runs. The dog runs fast would stand alone. Great. But now think about this. Take away the and just go to the last part of the sentence. Loves to play fetch. Is that a sentence that stands alone? Loves to play fetch? No. What's missing? Look in red. Missing the subject. Okay? So in this case, you'd say the dog runs fast and loves to play fetch. No commas, because you're not linking together two things that would stand alone. That's the trick there. Okay? Pay attention to that, because that's one of the places where the most errors can be made. Often when I give this lesson, people think, oh, anytime I use the word and, there has to be a comma before it. Not true. Anytime you use comma and, you need to, most times when you use comma and, you need to be linking together two complete sentences that would stand alone on either side. Loves to play fetch is a dependent clause. It's one of those babies that doesn't want to be left alone, right? So in this case, it does not get linked together the way that two independent clauses would. So, let's talk about those special words that you use along with the commas. There's a great mnemonic that you can use in order to remember them. Now, I just used that weird word, mnemonic. It's a really weirdly spelled word, right? A mnemonic is simply a mental trick that you use in order to memorize something or remember something. It comes from the same root as the word mnemonic is linked to the word memory, okay? So you can, if you just remember this word, fanboys, then you can pretty quickly call to mind those special words that you use along with the comma to link together two sentences that would stand alone. So the coordinating conjunctions, you could think of them as fanboys. Why? Well, it's an acronym. For and nor, but or, yet so. Okay? If you're in my class, you should memorize these. I would recommend if you're in any college composition class, or if you are practicing improving your sentence level writing and your grammar, I think it's a good idea to memorize these. Very easy to memorize. Fanboys, just remember fanboys. For my students, I will often give quizzes where there will be an extra credit question that will say, name the 7 coordinating conjunctions. Now, all you have to do is remember coordinating conjunctions. Oh, he means fanboys. For and nor, but or, yet so. All right? Really wonderful mnemonic. You know, when I was in school and I memorized, and I had to learn this, my teacher said, and, but, or, for, nor, so, yet. And I had to write it over and over again, and, but, or, for, nor, so, yet, and, but, or, for, nor, so, yet, until it was just drilled into my brain. And then one of my students eventually said, wouldn't it be more clever if you said for and, nor, but, or, yet so, because you could go fanboys? And I was like, this is why everyone's smarter now than they were when I was in school. But anyway, fanboys. Remember fanboys, and you're going to be in great shape for remembering how to link these things together. So here's a little bit more on that. All right, fanboys are very specific words. Their fanboys, or coordinating conjunctions, are the only words that you use along with a comma in order to link together those two sentences that would stand alone. Okay? Here's the thing. words like however and therefore, unless, nevertheless, nonetheless, those aren't fanboys. There's no U in fanboys. There's no T in fanboys, okay? Just remember, all the fanboys, they are small words with 3 letters or less, right? 5 of them have got 3 letters, other ones have got 2 letters. If you're confused and you're like, oh, should I say comma however? Just think, is however a fanboy? And you'll go F-A-N-B-O-Y-S, no H. No, right? So just remember, small little fanboy words, okay? You don't use words like however, therefore, unless, nevertheless, nonetheless. And there's a bunch of other ones too. You don't use those. Those are often they're transitional phrases, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on, but they don't work the same. Those 7 words are very special. They've got very special meaning in terms of our sentence construction. And that's why I think it would be very wise to memorize them. Only fanboys can be used along with a comma to link together 2 independent clauses, okay? So I'm gonna just go back here, right? You would not say, the dog runs fast, comma, however, he loves to play fetch. I mean, one that wouldn't exactly make sense, but you wouldn't do that. It's only comma and, comma but, comma nor. And note that you have to use the right fanboys for the circumstance. You wouldn't say, the dog runs fast, comma, nor he loves to play fetch. That doesn't make any logical sense, right? You have to use the right word for the right circumstance. The dog runs fast, comma, but he rolls in the grass when he's tired. I don't know, whatever, right? Make sure that you're using the appropriate coordinating conjunction or fanboy to link the sentences together. All right, so just remember, only fanboys are used with commas. It's a real specific thing, right? Comma fanboy or semicolon. Now those 2 things, they serve exactly the same function. Imagine that it was math. They're perfectly equivalent, right? And what you decide to use or not use is really your decision. It's really a matter of style. You know, if we were to go back to these examples, the dog runs fast and he loves to play fetch sounds one way. The dog runs fast, he loves to play fetch sounds another way. That's a stylistic choice. Both of those are grammatically correct. The first, doing it as 2 sentences, is grammatically correct. They're all just different options that give a different flavor or a different texture. It'll be different with the word but, though, for example, right? I like to ski, comma, but I like ice skating more. Well, there's a meaning with that but, okay? I'm saying, well, but one of these things is more than the other. Pause, hesitation. Don't apply these blindly. You have to examine the context of the sentence in order to make sure that you're using them correctly. All right, so here's, again, just another reminder, right? I know I've already said this, but remember this. You don't always use a comma with fanboys, okay? The dog runs fast and loves to play fetch. This was on the previous slide, and we talked about it a little bit. The dog runs fast and loves to play fetch. Why is there no comma here? Well, the and, in this case, is not linking together 2 independent clauses, okay? Loves, and if you're struggling with this, literally put your hand over part of the sentence, right? Before and after the and, right? If you're thinking, do I need the comma here? We'll go, okay, on this side, is it a complete sentence that stands alone? The dog runs fast. Yes, okay? On this side, after the and, loves to play fetch. Is that a complete sentence that stands alone? Loves to play fetch. What's it missing? He loves to play fetch. Missing a subject, no comma. You could go comma and he loves to play fetch, right? But if you leave the he out, if there's no subject, then you leave the comma out as well. Because, right, and here's the rule again, you use, if you've got 2 independent clauses, 2 sentences that stand alone, you use either a comma and a fanboy or a semicolon to link them together. That's the whole thing. Now, that is the thing that people forget the most in their writing. All of the other comma rules, there's some things to learn, but they're extremely simple and straightforward in comparison to this. This is the one, because it's not intuitive, right? We often think of a comma as being the place where we pause to take a breath or pause for meaning. Well, in this case, the comma and the fanboy, right, or the semicolon is used to link 2 things together. It's not being used so much it's not being used as a pause, it's being used as a connective tissue for the sentence. So you need to just make sure that you understand those rules and use them correctly when you're doing your writing, okay? And remember everything, right? Sometimes people remember comma and fanboy or semicolon, but then they forget that it's got to be an independent clause on both sides. In my class, when I give quizzes, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll have an independent clause and a dependent clause, and you've got to be able to recognize and catch that those don't link together the same way. So just be mindful of that. Okay, with that out of the way, we can now move into the comma rules and semicolon rules that are much easier to remember. So let's go through these and we'll see what we can do. All right, you use commas to offset introductory phrases. This is going to be pretty intuitive. There's just one little trick to it, and I'll walk you through it. Use a comma after an introductory phrase at the beginning of a sentence. And then the tricky thing is that if you could take that same phrase and put it at the end of the sentence, then you don't use a comma. So here's some examples, right? Introductory phrase. Near a small stream at the bottom of the canyon, comma, the rangers discovered a mine. All right? What's the core sentence here? Remember I said every sentence has got an anchor that's an independent clause. Well, think of it this way. What's the subject? Who's the actor in the sentence? It's the rangers, right? What did they do? What's their action? They discovered a mine. So this part here, this is the independent clause. The introductory phrase is a dependent clause. It's extra information. It's the baby, right? Near a small stream at the bottom of a canyon. Would that stand alone? Could you walk up to someone and say, near a small stream at the bottom of a canyon? And they would say, what near a small stream at the bottom of a canyon? Ooh, you're not giving me enough. This is basically a kind of a dependent clause, right? So if it's a phrase that you use at the beginning of the sentence before the independent clause, just use a comma, right? But if you can take that same phrase then and put it at the end of the sentence, if you do that, you don't put the comma. Note, the same phrase, near a small stream at the bottom of a canyon, near a small stream at the bottom of a canyon, right? In both cases, right? The rangers discovered a mine near a small stream at the bottom of the canyon, no comma, because that's an introductory phrase, right? Well, in this case, it's not. In this case, it's being used as an introductory phrase. In this case, it's just the rest of the information, right? Another easier example. Before I go to work, comma, I like to drink coffee. What's the core of the sentence? I like to drink coffee. That's the anchor. That's the independent clause that stands alone. I like to drink coffee. Pardon me. Well, this is all introductory. Before I go to work, dependent clause. Before I go to work, comma, I like to drink coffee. I like to drink coffee before I go to work. So just note with this that if you've got a phrase, a dependent phrase, always isolate the independent part of the sentence first, the part that would stand alone. Isolate that first. Then if there's something else, another dependent clause, dependent part of speech that could come before, if it would come before, use the comma. If it can go after, don't use the comma. That's pretty much the rule, right? I'll go back to the explanation slide, right? Use a comma after the introductory phrase at the beginning of the sentence. But if you take that same phrase and put it at the end after the main clause, then you don't use the comma. That's it for introductory phrases. So you could think about this, right? Usually, you know, I mean, I could spin a bunch of them right off the top of my head. After I take a shower, comma, I dry my hair. Okay, after I take a shower, introductory phrase, comma, I dry my hair. But you can flip those around. I dry my hair after I take a shower. Well, no comma in that case. Just note, note what the main part of the sentence is and what the dependent part of the sentence is. That's where we're moving away. So if the rule before was about how you link independent parts of speech, right? Two things that would stand alone. Now we're thinking, how do we link together things that don't stand alone that way? That's the trick. All right, so we looked at a couple of those examples. Let's move on to another comma rule. This is the really easy one. Commas in lists. We're going to have some fun with this too. You'd think this is going to be really boring, but trust me. Commas in lists. You use commas to separate items in a series or a list. So, for example, Megan likes apples, comma, oranges, comma, and strawberries. So you got a bunch of things, you're listing them. I like tomatoes, comma, cucumbers, comma, and lettuce, period, right? And items in a list. No matter how many items there are on the list, use commas to distinguish the items in the series. We will write a summary assignment, comma, an explanation paper, comma, and an evaluation. Very few people have trouble with this, okay? So we could move on, except usually when I'm teaching this, a question comes up right about now. And the question that often comes up is, do you have to use the last comma in the series in the list? So for example, Megan likes apples, comma, oranges, comma, and strawberries. Do you have to use a comma after the last one? Couldn't you say Megan likes apples, comma, oranges, and strawberries? Do you need that last comma in the series or in the sequence? Believe it or not, this is a topic of hot debate that people flame each other on the internet over tremendously. If you go onto Facebook and or anywhere really and start an argument with people who know anything about writing about whether or not you should use that last comma in the list, there will be fights that will break out, bitter, intense battles, because people have very strong opinions about this. Here's how to navigate that sticky, thorny issue. In short, both are correct. People are just fussy about their preferences, right? This final comma in the series is called the serial comma, or it's often called the Oxford comma. Go onto Google Images and look up the Oxford comma, and you're going to see a bunch of cartoons of people flaming each other about whether or not they should use it or not, right? I like to think of it personally as the patriotism comma, and here's why. In the United States, we do most often use the final comma in the series, but in other English-speaking places, writers in the UK, places like that, they often do not. So I humorously like to say that if you love America, use the last comma in the sequence. But if you're not so much into America, then leave it out. You can make a little bit of a political statement there. That's not actually really true at all, but I think it can be a fun way to kind of remember, right? If you are a warm-blooded American, you use that last comma in the series. If you're from somewhere else, or maybe you're critical of America's policies, something like that, leave the comma out. Honestly, though, what it will really come down to is different editors will choose different styles. If you're writing for a journal, or you're writing for a newspaper, or you're writing a book, or you're writing anything for publication ever, the editor will have their preference. The trick is that usually in the United States, the preference is for the comma, for the Oxford comma. Usually, if you're writing somewhere else, the preference is going to be to not use that comma. You might be thinking, that's really weird, Dr. Higgins. Why do people fight about that? Who cares, right? Well, here's why people sometimes care about this. In some cases, the Oxford comma can resolve confusion. Take, for example, this sentence. She interviewed 2 porn stars, President Obama and a college professor. One could read that and think, she interviewed 2 porn stars. One of them was President Obama, the other was a college professor. If you use the final comma, it's more obvious that those are items in a list or in a series, okay? If you use that final comma, you don't mistakenly present our president as being a porn star, right? Which is an impression that you probably wouldn't want to give when you were, I don't know why this sentence would ever come up, but you get the idea. The meaning in this case would be that she interviewed these people, this person, and this person, right? And that in this case, it looks like, you know, you get the idea. All right. The problem is, so advocates for the final comma say, use it to prevent these kinds of mistakes. But then on the other side, the thing is that the Oxford comma can also create confusion, okay? As in this sentence. I interviewed my wife, Lady Gaga, and a famous politician. That could make it sound like Lady Gaga was my wife, because I was putting this in as a bit of extra information. I interviewed my wife, Lady Gaga, and a famous politician. That's probably not what the sentence was meaning to say. This person probably meant to say, I interviewed my wife, Lady Gaga, and a famous politician. So the thing I would do is, you know, if you find that the sentence could be confusing, either with or without that final comma in the series, you know, do what you need to do in order to make that clear. Otherwise, just be consistent, right? I think that almost every writing instructor would say, unless they're going to take a hard line on this, almost every writing instructor is going to say either use the last comma in the series consistently or don't use it consistently, but don't jump around between using them. I personally, being a patriot, prefer that my students use the final comma in the series. But I'm not going to mark points off if you don't, if you're in my class. I simply want you to know the rules and where you have the option of using them or not using them. All right. So now there's one other thing, semicolons. Really, the main use of semicolons is the one that we talked about before. The main use for a semicolon is to link together 2 sentences that would stand alone. I like Lady Gaga, semicolon, she wears a meat dress, period. Two sentences that would stand alone, link them with the semicolon. However, semicolons do have this other special rare function that you should know about. You can use a semicolon to separate items in a list if the items in the list themselves actually have commas. This does not come up very often, but here's an example. I've been to Chicago, Illinois. Note, there's a comma between Chicago and Illinois, right? Semicolon, Los Angeles, California, Paris, France, and Omaha, Nebraska. I have no idea why you would be going to both Paris, France, and Omaha, Nebraska, but that's beside the point, right? The items in the list themselves, Chicago, Illinois, Los Angeles, California, Paris, France, Omaha, Nebraska, right? The items in the list themselves have commas that are separating the items. So in this case, the semicolon becomes kind of a super comma for, and you'll see people on the internet even talk about it as a super comma for separating the items in a list. Very rare, hardly ever comes up. Most of the time, just remember that a semicolon is linking together two sentences that would stand alone. But if you find yourself with a complicated list of items that have got commas in them, then you use semicolons to separate those items in the list. We only have a couple of more comma rules to learn. We're very close to the end of this presentation, so let's go ahead with them. The first is non-restrictive clauses. That's some fancy language, but don't be intimidated. Just like everything else, it's pretty straightforward. You use a comma to set off what we call a non-restrictive clause, or a part of the sentence that contains non-essential or parenthetical information. That is to say, if there's a part of the sentence that you could remove without damaging the meaning of the sentence as a whole, then you can set it off with commas. So, for example, the children will need sturdy shoes, comma, which are expensive. In this case, the core of the sentence, the independent clause, is the children will need sturdy shoes. You could put a period there, it would stand alone. Which are expensive is extra, non-restrictive information. Therefore, you can set it off with a comma. Usually, dependent clauses, you can just do the comma. No coordinating conjunction, no semicolon, just a comma, depending on how it's operating, all right? Also, the helicopter with its million candle power spotlight circled above. Well, what's the core of the sentence? The helicopter, subject, circled verb. The helicopter circled above, period. That's the part that would stand alone. All of this information, you could take it out or you could leave it in. If you can take it out without damaging the meaning of the sentence, then you set it off with commas. So essentially, if the information or the words can be removed without damaging the meaning of the sentence, it's probably what we'd call a non-restrictive clause or something that you can offset with commas. So take a sentence like this. My younger sister, who plays left wing on the soccer team, now lives at the Sands, a beach house near Los Angeles. Well, the core of the sentence is subject, actor, my younger sister, lives, verb. My younger sister now lives at the Sands. That's the independent clause. That's the thing that would stand alone. My younger sister, who plays left wing on the soccer team, you could take that out. The Sands, a beach house near Los Angeles, a lot of times that extra information is descriptive information. It gives us more detail, it fleshes things out for us, it shows us a little bit more, but it's not something that we really need or is vital to our understanding, so you can take it out instead of leaving it in. So that's the whole thing with non-restrictive clauses. All we then have left is transitional words and little minor phrases. And a lot of those you also offset with a comma. And in this case, in this specific case, it's usually where there would naturally be some sort of pause if you were actually verbally saying it. So, however is a good word. Remember we said, however, not a fanboy. There's no H in fanboys, okay? Jim did not understand our language, semicolon. However, comma, he was familiar with our customs. Let's break this down a little bit because it's really important to understand. What do we have here? Jim did not understand our language, period. Would that be an independent clause? Jim did not understand our language. Yeah, Jim, subject, did not understand, verb, our language, period, would stand alone. Now take out the semicolon, however, all that kind of stuff. He was familiar with our customs. Would it stand alone as a sentence? He was familiar with our customs. Subject, verb, the rest of the information. would stand alone. So that's why this semicolon is here. The semicolon is here because it's linking together two sentences that would stand alone. What's happened here is that we have a word that's not a fanboy, that's forming a transition, a transitional phrase. Jim did not understand our language. Now you could take however out, actually. You could just say, Jim did not understand our language, semicolon, he was familiar with our customs, period. But actually we want this transition for the purpose of meaning. So you say, however, comma, right? Words like however, therefore, nonetheless, usually you'll offset those with a comma. You might say, I like, I'm trying to think of a good example. I like comic books, therefore, I like comic books, semicolon, therefore, comma, I enjoyed the recent Superman movie. I mean, something along those lines, right? Transitional phrases, transitional expressions, you offset with the comma, okay? So think of it this way. Instead of saying, you could say, Jim did not understand our language, comma, but he was familiar with our customs. All right, so that would be the other rule, not using the semicolon. But you could go semicolon, however, comma, right? That's the trick there. That'll be something that in my class I'll quiz, right? Your understanding of that. So if you don't feel like you followed that, chat with me after the video's over or between classes, and I'll be happy to go into greater detail on that for you. Another example, as a matter of fact, comma, American football was established by rugby fans. As a matter of fact, transitional minor parenthetical information. So you offset it with a comma. Evolution, as far as we know, doesn't work this way. Well, this just works just like a non-restrictive clause, right? It's information that you could take out. Evolution doesn't work this way. Evolution, as far as we know, it's like if you pause and put an extra bit of information in, you set it off with the commas. The philosophers sought mental, not physical pleasures. Comma, not physical. Because, the philosophers sought mental pleasures. Mental, not physical pleasures. Again, you can kind of hear the natural pause there, right? Yes, the loan will be ready tomorrow. A minor phrase, a very small extra piece of information that's put in there, okay? So, to review, you use a comma and a fanboy, and one of the fanboys, or a semicolon to link together two sentences that would stand alone. All right? You use a comma to set off an introductory phrase, but if that same introductory phrase would go at the end of the sentence, you don't use a comma. You use commas to offset items in a list. Okay? Item A, comma, item B, comma, item C, etc., etc. You use commas for non-restrictive phrases, or that is to say things that you could remove from the sentence without damaging the information. And you use commas for minor transitional words and transitional phrases. That's really what you need to know, okay? So with that all in mind, I'm going to walk you through a practice quiz. On the next slides, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a sentence that has an error of some sort based on the rules that we've just talked about. And what I want you to do, if you're doing this at home, you might pause the video and think for a moment about how you'd try to correct the sentence, identify the error in the sentence and correct it, and then move forward, and I'll talk about the corrections to each sentence as we go along. So can you correct the comma and semicolon errors in each of the following sentences? Here's the trick. All right? Remember, a lot of times you need to be able to distinguish the independent clause, or the anchor of the sentence that stands alone, and the dependent clauses, or the babies in the department stores, in order to make accurate corrections. Don't forget about that. Don't just think comma and then it's corrected. No, 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 no. Figure out which case it is, which rule you're using, and how it works. So let's take a look at some examples. Question number 1. The man's trash includes newspapers, wrappers, old cans, and tissues. What would you do to improve this sentence? Here's my recommendation. In this case, we've got a problem because these are items in a list. The man's trash includes newspapers, comma, wrappers, comma, old cans, comma, and tissues, period. Very simple, very straightforward items in a list. Note, I used the comma after old cans, but you could omit that final comma in the series. I think that generally in American usage, you're going to leave it and include it. Okay? Question number 2. Before I leave for school, I like to brew some coffee. What's wrong with this sentence? Which of the comma or semicolon rules do you need to use in order to correct this? In this case, what we're looking at is an introductory phrase. Before I leave for school, comma, I like to brew some coffee. But note, this is one of those cases where you could take the phrase at the beginning and put it at the end without using the comma. I like to brew some coffee before I leave for school. Note, I leave for school would stand alone, but this before has turned it into a dependent clause. So if it's at the beginning, use the comma. If you move it to the end, take the comma away. All right, question number 3. Frank Herbert wrote fine books. Moreover, they were read by millions. I'm thinking of Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune, by the way. What's wrong with this sentence? So in this case, you have to remember that moreover is not a fanboy. Essentially, what we have here are 2 independent clauses, 2 sentences or 2 parts of speech that would stand alone as sentences. Frank Herbert wrote fine books, period. That would be great. They were read by millions, period. That would be great. So in this case, you don't use a comma moreover. You'd say semicolon, and then moreover is one of those transitional phrases like however or therefore. Moreover, comma, they were read by millions. Just remember, moreover is not one of the fanboys. You could also say Frank Herbert wrote fine books, comma, and they were read by millions. If you wanted to keep the and, you'd have to get rid of the moreover and include a fanboy instead. All right, moving on to question number 4. The puzzle piece, which was hidden beneath the box, fits the corner square. What's going on with this sentence? How would you correct the errors here? In this case, we've got a non-restrictive clause, or a piece of information that could be taken out without damaging the meaning of the sentence. Think of it this way. What's the subject? The puzzle piece. What's the actor? The puzzle piece. What's it doing? It's fitting. That's the subject and the verb. The puzzle piece fits the corner square. Which was hidden beneath the box? Non-important information, extra descriptive information. You can take that information out without damaging the meaning of the sentence. Therefore, you set it off with commas. Final question for our practice quiz, number 5. Anthony reads comics and likes Green Lantern best of all. This could be sort of a tricky one for some people. What would you do to correct the error, a very common type of error, that we see in this sentence? In this case, there are several ways to correct the sentence depending on what you're doing. This is like the more complicated example in the rule that everyone forgets, right? So Anthony reads comics, the original example is Anthony reads comics, comma, and likes Green Lantern best of all. How would I break this down? Well, we've got a comma and. What has to be on both sides of comma and? You have to have a sentence that would stand alone. So let's test. Anthony reads comics, period. Does that stand alone? Sure. All right, go after the and. Likes Green Lantern best of all. Does that stand alone? Likes Green Lantern best of all? No. What's it missing? It's missing the subject, he. So in order to use the comma and, we'd have to add the subject back in. So there's several different ways that we can correct this. We can say Anthony reads comics, comma, and he likes Green Lantern best of all. Or you could take away the comma and leave the subject out. Anthony reads comics and likes Green Lantern best of all. You're removing the comma because this likes Green Lantern best of all is not an independent clause. It's just extra information, okay? The final way that you could do it is you could switch to a semicolon. This would require you to switch things around a little bit. Anthony reads commas, Anthony reads comics, semicolon, he likes Green Lantern best of all. Just make sure that you're following the rule. And I think the thing where people get mixed up following the rule is that they forget comma and has to have a sentence that would stand alone with a subject and verb on both sides. All right? So you either add the subject and have comma and or semicolon, Or leave the subject out and just have it run along. Let it flow, as one of my students has often said in the past. So with that, you've got the basics at this point of commas and semicolons. You hopefully at this point understand the difference between independent clauses, which stand alone, and dependent clauses, which need to be connected to something else. You know how commas and semicolons work in order to link things together in sentences. So here's the big takeaway. Don't get caught thinking that commas are things that you use when you think that you would pause in speech. Speech and writing, as much as we like to think that they're similar, are actually very different. And the reason for that is because when we're speaking, people can get a sense of what we mean and clarify their understanding of what we're saying because of our emphasis, because of the tone of our voice, because of the pace, timing, pauses, gestures, all those things. Those things are all missing when you're using written language. All they have is what's there in front of you. And commas, semicolons, punctuation, other things like this, they're vital, they form vital signals to help your reader's understanding. If you can memorize these rules, I know that we've gone through a lot here, but I think that if you break these down into the individual rules, they're pretty, they're not that difficult to grasp. There's some things you've got to memorize. You've got to memorize the fanboys. You've got to memorize the formula for how the independent clauses connect. There's some things to learn there, but overall, I don't think that they're as scary as a lot of people often make them out to be. If you just memorize these rules and start to apply them to your writing, you're going to find that your writing will be more clear, more crisp, and free of the kinds of errors that can often be distracting to readers when they're trying to understand you. And most importantly, people will not make fun of you on the internet. So do what you need to do in order to get these rules into your head. In my classes, we'll definitely be quizzing these and putting them into use during the rest of the semester. Thank you very much.